Grazie. Solamente i ringraziamenti in italiano, l'intervento in inglese per ragioni di traduzione. Volevo ringraziare in prima istanza Maria Rosa Suarez Inclán, che mi ha invitato, e grazie anche all'amica collega Rosanna Genovese che ha fatto il mio nome per partecipare a questo convegno. E successivamente voglio ringraziare Anna Del Clos per tutti gli sforzi che ha fatto per organizzare il convegno e anche il nostro soggiorno qui, la municipalità di Madrid e l'ICOMOS in generale di Spagna. So now I'm sorry, but I have to speak in English. It's not so evident for me. Next time I will speak Spanish, probably, in any way. So I start with this. I want to just to remember that the idea of cultural landscape started at the beginning of last century, and with some geographers, as Karl Sawyer and Otto Schulter, as yesterday has been told to us. The cultural landscape considers different aspects of man's intervention with nature. It is evident. The cultural landscape is the result of a very long coexistence between man and nature. But the definition given by the World Heritage Committee of cultural landscape, we know, everyone knows, as cultural property that represent the combined works of man and nature, is now very well known and also accepted, I think, by everyone. In my lecture, I will start, according to the 7 points indicated in the suggested program for the conference, with the local Italian situation in the relationship to the protected landscapes, and then I will go through some examples of Italian and Tuscan UNESCO sites, as I'm working in Florence, and I know better than other areas. Of course, I know the Tuscan region. So the first point is scope and meaning and so on. Protected landscapes are not automatically cultural landscapes. I mean that when, for example, in Italy, we started the legal protection of landscape, didn't exist during the 30s of last century, didn't exist at all the concept of cultural landscape. And to tell you the truth, didn't exist also the concept of landscape. Or at least it was not used at all as a term. It doesn't exist the word in our laws, Italian laws. So we can affirm that the history of the idea of cultural landscape is relatively short. Apart from the first studies of the geographers at the beginning of last century, we can affirm that the development of the idea of cultural landscape dates from the 90s of last century and had been spread out by the UNESCO, of course. In Italy, the idea of protecting the landscape started at the beginning of last century. Sorry, this is just to remember us. It's a very interesting thing. Not by chance, at the beginning of 16th century, in Italy, in Tuscan and in Lazio region, humanists created a very original expression, the third nature, terza natura, to indicate the nature of the garden as a work of art composed by the work of man together with the nature. And there are many documents in which they speak about, Taeggio, for example, speak about this idea of the nature of the garden is the third nature, something different from the nature. So it's in some way introducing the idea of a cultural landscape. So the first protection laws dated 1939 and were divided in two sectors. One for things, we say beni, cose, of artistic and historic interest, what now we can call cultural heritage, and the second law was concerned on natural beauty. It's quite interesting, the term, not landscape at all. It was natural beauty, bellezze naturali, the concept of beauty. It's something, as our Japanese colleague yesterday has told us, and I agree with her. So it was evident that from the origin the problem was connected to a kind of dichotomy between nature and culture, and that the heritage was divided for that reason into different sectors. Probably this point of view and the difficulties to manage the traditional difference between art and nature is common to the most part of European protection laws, not only in Italy. But it is very interesting that in the first law, 4 categories, not typologies to tell the truth, 4 categories of things were included in the protection. And it is, I have tried the translation, things with remarkable natural beauty or geological uniqueness. Second, villas, parks, and gardens not protected with the law for monuments, which are characterized by uncommon beauty. Uncommon beauty is also a term quite interesting. Then sets of things, groups forming characteristic aspect having aesthetic and traditional value, and the last, panoramic beauties, considered as natural paintings. And this idea of paintings is also in one of the UNESCO criterion, quadri naturali, and also point of view, like Belvedere, for example, accessible to the public, from which you enjoy the spectacle of those beauties. So aesthetic, beauty, panorama were the key words in our first law, and these 4 categories are still working on, are still in the modern, last law is 2004, but the categories remain the same. So just an example, this is a kind of decree, the area along the Arno River, close to Florence, and just to give you an example, and this nice place, of course, not of universal value, but very interesting, the hills surrounding Florence, and the motivation for this protection, very, very short, is the area near and so on, along the Arno River and so on and so on. For these reasons, the area forms with picturesque views of the Arno River, villas, parks and trees, from the National Road to Settignano and so on, a natural framework of singular and scenic beauty as a whole, a characteristic which has aesthetic and traditional value and also offers many points of view accessible to the public. So these are our main concepts. More recently, in 2004, the new Italian law has introduced the term landscape for the first time. Not so recent, I mean, meglio tardi che mai, diciamo così in italiano. In any way, the term has been introduced, not the term of cultural landscape, but just landscape, and the categories are the same. So at the beginning, that's the Italian situation, and the term, we know, the term cultural landscape started to be used in Italy at the beginning of the 90s. We have seen many times at this point that in 1972, the World Heritage Convention started with cultural heritage and natural heritage. So cultural heritage, monuments, and so on, natural heritage, natural features, geological and physiographical formation. natural beauty, it is written in 1972 also. And if we now consider this, the point of the World Heritage Convention, this separation is clear for us that something was lacking, essentially, the idea of landscape as heritage, because cultural, natural, and in the middle, there is the landscape, in fact. So in 1992, the concept of cultural landscape was officially introduced. Maybe I can just pass, because other speakers have told many interesting things about what the World Heritage Convention has introduced, the concept of cultural landscapes, and also the main typologies, designed landscapes, organically evolved landscapes, associative cultural landscape. Now we know, but we can just consider that the point of view of the UNESCO has to be, of course, very large. The concept of outstanding universal value, it is part of a worldwide perspective. So we have to list, when we are speaking about a UNESCO site, we are speaking about something to which the entire world cannot renounce, and the entire world has to know in some way and to recognize in this value. So the categories or typologies which ICOMOS has suggested are enough comprehensive of the huge variety of landscapes which we can find on the world. But the difficulty is to recognize, to assess, to identify the landscape. What we can notice, according to our experience on the field, is that in Italy it's quite difficult to separate at a conceptual level a landscape from a cultural landscape. Also, this point has been treated yesterday, because at the end we can think that all the landscape is cultural, because nel mondo, in the world, there is no part of the world where the man has not left some traces. This is probably a limit of the definition. Can exist a landscape on our globe, on our world, where the man has not left a memory of his passage? Apart from the mountain, but we can discuss also about this. And in any way, the landscape is a landscape because there is a man looking at it, looking at the landscape. The landscape is always a man's work, also in the small protected areas. For example, in Italy, we have, just an example, this is a so-called Riserva Naturale Integrale, means that no man is allowed to go in. It's completely closed, just some religious. They have created this sacred woodland, and they are just allowed to go in. But no tourist, no man at all. But also this is a cultural landscape, if you want. So, of course, this is a general point of view, and in our world there are different, we have seen also yesterday, different situation, not only in South America, which is more similar to Europe, but now I am thinking to landscapes in Africa, for example, where it's quite difficult probably to apply with this kind of ideas. So the second point, one of the biggest difficulties in understanding the identity of one landscape is surely connected to a unique element of the landscape. The landscape is a living work of art, and is living apart from the man. And at the same time, the landscape exists thanks to the man, because the man is living in it and it is looking at it. Rosario Assunto is a philosopher, an Italian philosopher, very well known in Italy, but not only in Italy. He wrote that the landscape is a work of art inside which we live. We are not looking at the landscape, but we are living inside the landscape, in the landscape at the same time. When we are looking at a fresco, when we are looking at a painting, we are not living inside the painting. So this is completely, this concept, of course, we can use also for architecture, but for landscape is more pertinent. And furthermore, the landscape is changing continuously. The problem of the changement, el cambio, someone told yesterday something about this problem. I remember the interesting title by Gilles Clément, Les Jardins en Mouvement, perhaps you know. So we can say the landscape is in movement continuously. And we have to accept this changement. But at the same time, it's very strange, it's very incredible how many relics we can find of very old landscape, as for example, this is a Medici villa, recently recognized amongst a group of 14 Medici villas, UNESCO site. So this is Villa Cafaggiolo, painted at the end of 16th century. It is a kind of portrait of a villa with a lot of incredible detail. But if you look at this landscape, you can recognize the building, of course, and the garden just behind, and some grove of ragnaia, and the rural landscape, rural buildings, the stables on the left, and a road in front, passage in front, the river in front also, and a passage in front of the Prato of the villa. And a recent aerial photo shows us, it's incredible because this is the so-called Lorenzo il Magnifico landscape. The garden has changed with a lot of big trees planted during the 19th century, but the architecture of the garden is still there, and it requires a very strong restoration project. At the moment, it's a private property with a big development program all around. But you see, the rural buildings are the same, and the stables are the same. The road, the river is not in the photo, just some details have changed. So it's incredible. The landscape is continuously changing, but it is also simile a se stesso. It looks like itself in some way. So this is the core zone in red, you see here, and the very huge buffer zone of the UNESCO site, Villa di Cafaggiolo. So in any way, the landscape is a living heritage. This means that we have to accept the fact that the landscape is changing. It is in movement. We have to manage the changement, and probably it is the most difficult thing. So shortly, identification and functional and so on. These are, we know very well, the typology, category typology. Carmen Agnon this morning, she prefers to use the term typology, but in fact the term category I have downloaded by the internet. So in any way, we know landscape designed, it is easy. Garden, parkland, gardens related to monumental buildings and so on. Organically evolved landscape is more difficult. For me, mostly the relict or fossil landscape. Continuing evolving landscape in some ways, each landscape is continuously evolving. And associative cultural landscape, also this third typology. I don't know probably a landscape which is not associative, but also the landscape of the garden of the royal family in England, I don't know, are associative in some way. But in any way, it's a very important concept, the association, because you, in some way, you find your identity in some places. Just to compare, because there are many cultural landscape definitions if we are looking around. And as I met one of the responsible of the National Park Services in the United States, I was just interested in give a look what they use. Their definition is, very pertinent. It defined a geographic area including both cultural and natural resources and the wildlife or domestic animals and so on, associated with an historic event, activity, or person. This point of view, which is also in the Italian law, because when we say an historic site, we mean, for example, the place where Napoleone has slept one night, or where Garibaldi spent 1 week. It are historic places for us. And maybe also for the history of the United States, it is similar. And they use 4 general types of cultural landscape: historic design landscape, historic vernacular landscape, historic site, ethnographic landscape. It's just another point of view, just to compare. I think it's interesting to have another different approach. But coming back to the 4th point, analysis of the situation of certain cultural landscape. In Italy, we have 50 UNESCO sites. I'm not sure, but probably is the nation in the world with the biggest number, the largest quantity of UNESCO sites, I think. And only in Tuscany we have 7 UNESCO sites, which is really a lot, of course. But during our nice lunch with some Spanish friend, they are probably in the room. Some of you has said in Italy we have too many, the heritage is so huge that can be difficult just to protect. But I am not so convinced, but I have heard many times people saying, you have too much. But when you are rich, you have not to stop and to be poor. You are just rich. It's okay, I agree. In any way, we have started in 82 with Florence Historic Center, and then now we have 2 cultural landscape, which are Val d'Orcia and the recent inscription of the Villa Medici, 14 villas, and also Pratolino has no more villa, it's just the big park, you know. So I have just given a look to this, to 2 examples. One, it is in Tuscany, and the other is in the north of Italy. For example, Val d'Orcia, because we have been asked to, in some way, try to, at least to discuss if there are some problems, if there are some contradictions. It's a big responsibility. I'm not sure to be able to, to really explain which are the contradictions and which can be the new parameters of judgment, of assessment. It's quite difficult. So I just want to show some, not exactly contradiction, but some difficulties we can find when we are managing UNESCO sites. Val d'Orcia, I don't know if you know, it's a region in the south part of Siena. It is a really incredible place. It has been inscripted using the 2 criteria, 4th and 6th. So the Val d'Orcia, an exceptional reflection of the way the landscape was rewritten in Renaissance time to reflect the ideals of good governance. Maybe I have to explain, because it is not so evident. And the second criterion, 7, the landscape of the Val d'Orcia was celebrated by painters, and so on and so on. But this is they are speaking about a famous fresco in the palace, in the civil Palazzo Civico in Siena by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, which is considered the starting the starting document, iconographical document of the idea of landscape in the world, in the Occidental world, of course. And because there is the walls, the medieval walls of Siena, the enclosed city, the medieval walls, imagine you, and a group of men and women with horses going out from the medieval walls towards the country. And the country is a beautiful country, really similar to the landscape of the Crete Senesi and Val d'Orcia. The only problem is that, you see, this is the core zone, and in green, this is small, the buffer zone. Don't ask me why, I mean, there is surely a reason, but I don't know. And in any way, they have decided to protect with buffer zone this small area at the periphery of the core zone. And in the red square I have designed here, there is La Foce. La Foce is an historic garden, very well known, which by chance it has been inside the core zone, not by chance, of course, but apparently by chance. And two problems are of interest for us. First, that in this core zone has been excluded, there are a lot of documents, but maybe I have not enough time to go through everything. Just to give you an idea, this is the landscape from one of the most famous part of Val d'Orcia, which is Castel del Bosco. Now it is a resort with a golf and so on, but very well managed, I have to say. And this is one of the most famous designed landscape created by Cecil Pinsent at the beginning of last century, in two different moments of the year. And this is La Foce, the historical garden designed by Cecil Pinsent, starting in the beginning, so-called, of the last century. But the problem is that, first of all, the changement in the assessment of the landscape. At the beginning of last century, when La Foce has been created, this region was considered an horrible place, abandoned from everybody, a desert, a ruin, a place where to build a house, as Iris and Antonio Origo, they did this in this beautiful creation, this beautiful project, but she was a writer, Iris Origo, an American-English writer, and she wrote in her book, Images and Shadows. It is like an autobiography, and she wrote, it was a desert, a landscape abandoned by the man. I felt myself alone, and that's why I decided to build such a house. So imagine you, this was the consideration everybody has about Val d'Orcia. But also in the 60s, if you read many texts by geographers concerning Crete Senesi and Val d'Orcia, you always find the same idea of a desert, of a place difficult to reach, far from everything, impossible to go, and so on. Now, La Foce, if you read a quite interesting book written by Michael Di Giovine, The Heritage Scape, UNESCO, World Heritage and Tourism, he wrote, La Foce is a now obligatory step of the Tuscan countryside tourist circuit, despite its distance from Cortona and Siena. Most likely had La Foce in mind when it recommended the Val d'Orcia for its associative quality as being a landscape as an icon, and in fact it is. The second, so this means that the cultural significance of a landscape is dynamic. It's an evident and quite interesting example. But the second problem is that the inscription in the list was not enough strong to protect this nice medieval village Montichiello with a perfect medieval walls and towers from a new, very criticized in Italy, it was really a problem since 10 years, a new series of buildings. So that's why yesterday I told that the inscription in the list, but also any kind of protection decree is not automatically a protection tool. It depends on many other factors. And furthermore, this is just to introduce the fact, this is a booklet I wrote in 2008, yes, for the Regione Toscana, with some itineraries in the Tuscan landscape. So you see Siena, Pienza, who was already inscripted in the UNESCO list, and the area of Val d'Orcia is here, it is not in the map, because my itinerary was this area, which it is one of the most important part of the Crete Senesi, but it is not inscripted. I really don't know why. If you give a look, this is the real landscape of the Crete, and it is close to Siena. There is a road, a very famous road for tourism, which is the road 438, which if you go to Siena, I suggest you to go there, because it's one of the most beautiful place in Tuscan. Incredible landscape, you see. And there are also some contemporary works of art. It's really a kind of view on the landscape. So this is probably one of the contradictions which we can enhance in some way. Another recent inscription is the Langhe cultural landscape, is in Piemonte, in the north of Italy. Another aspect, you see, this is a very large series of core zones and buffer zones, 5, I think. This is just, I have selected one, and this is the zone of so-called Canelli and Asti Spumante wines. These are white wines, but there are also other red wines. And this black-gray spot is Aquiterme. Aquiterme, it is a middle-sized town, but near Aquiterme, but outside of the buffer zone, there is an incredible modern, I can say, landscape, because it is not only the garden. The famous Italian architect Pietro Porcinai, whom probably someone of you knows, has designed the landscape around the villa, and also an incredible modern. He started here in 55 or 56 around, and he continued working to 70 around for a very rich family. And the building you see have been built in the 30s by Marcello Piacentini, a rationalist architect, very famous in Italy. And a huge lawn, not well maintained, you can say maybe, but with a very, very long pergola and many other features, quite interesting, designed by Pietro Porcinai. So this has been not included, and in my opinion, it's a pity, because similar examples of modern landscapes, because he designed also the landscape around, are very important, because this means that the landscape is changing and that the idea of an holistic landscape can be better represented if we include in the list also similar example. This garden has been recognized with a prize, with an European prize. So, I mean, it is a recognized value, of course, but it is a pity because it is just outside of the buffer zone. Speaking this morning with some of you, I have suggested, but of course, probably there are some difficulties, but concerning the Retiro, il Parco del Retiro, in my opinion, also the Caixa and the vertical garden can be included, because I have seen yesterday, no, not yesterday, but Sunday when I just have arrived, a lot of people taking photos of the Caixa as it was a Michelangelo work of art. So why not? I think this could be another aspect to take in consideration. And then, I don't know if I have how many minutes, someone? 5, thank you. So, quickly, considering these examples, it is evident that the definition and aim of cultural landscape are becoming larger and larger. So integrity and authenticity, an holistic approach has also been told yesterday, and are important parameters. Maybe an holistic approach to the landscape looks a good way to develop the cultural landscape as an ecological system, because we cannot really reducing the landscape to some parts, but to look at it as a whole is the central theme for all holistic approaches. And then I can conclude with this example and some consideration about management plans. A preliminary consideration is that people involved in protection and management of cultural landscape are today, of course, represented by a large group of disciplines, so it is an interdisciplinary approach. The methodology is, of course, focused on knowledge. It is obvious, but not so easy, in fact, to use. A management plan can be directed to ensure that its historic integrity is not altered and features are not lost, and also that the changement can be controlled or regulated in some way. I have recently been involved in a master plan, which is not exactly a management plan, but in some way we can find the same topics. A greenway can be considered as a planning tool, and the Florence Greenway offers, in fact, the possibility to develop an extraordinary cultural landscape in Florence, starting from the Greenway idea and passing to restore and develop all the area. I have to say that, excuse me, but I have to find the map just to show you. In black here, it is the limit of the UNESCO Historic Center of Florence site. In pink are all the monuments and parks and gardens protected by the Italian law. And in pink with stripes are 2 Medici villas. This is Boboli, which was already included in the historic center of Florence UNESCO site, and it has been included the second time in the Medici Villa Cultural Landscape UNESCO. So this is Boboli, and this is Villa di Poggio Imperiale, and in another Medici villas, beautiful, by the way, not so well known, but really worth of being known. It's incredible because if you want, we are so close to the center, and there are places not really well known. In gray, all this gray, you see, is the buffer zone of the Medici Villa Poggio Imperiale, so a very large buffer zone in this case. In green, you see our so-called Greenway, which goes across the buffer zone and starting from the center of Florence, across Boboli. This is the Bardini Garden, then Boboli, then the huge, incredible boulevard towards the Medici Villa. And this is a more recent park, dating second half of 19th century, which unluckily for everybody is now a kind of main road with a lot of urban traffic. But there is the possibility to develop it as a greenway because there are some corridors along the main road, and mostly there are some gardens, for example these, which has to be restored, is not in a very perfect situation, and these three gardens, so-called Bobolino, and we reach here one level, and we continue to walk at the same level to San Miniato and Piazzale Michelangelo. Then we go down towards the city, across an incredible architecture built in the second half of 19th century when Florence was for 7 years capital of Italy. And it's unbelievable, maybe, because we are in the center of Florence, but believe me, it is not well maintained, and we need to restore, to improve, and to create a new kind of circuit in the nature and in the art, because, for example, we have here a series of museums, Museo Bardini, in Boboli, Palazzo Pitti, Museo delle Porcellane, and so on, I can continue, it's a very long list, but when you go out, you reach the Piazzale Michelangelo, you have a Roseto, as we have seen today, not so beautiful as your in Retiro Park, but it's quite interesting Roseto here, and the Garden of the Iris is here. So imagine you a chain of museums, of gardens, with incredible vistas towards Florence. By the way, these are the three itineraries. We have not enough time. Just I come back to some slides. This is from Piazzale Michelangelo. This is Bardini Garden, and behind there is Boboli. This is the neglected area of the three Bobolino gardens. The main aim of the project is to offer to the tourist, to our 12 millions and more tourists each year, a new possibility of knowing the city of Florence. So it's a very important project also from an economic point of view, and also from the point of view of the management plan of the historic UNESCO site of historic center of Florence, because we have a pressure of a lot of tourists, and we have to a little bit move the tourists in other parts of our beautiful town. This is the Bardini Garden, and just to conclude, as an example, some points we have to go through when we are organizing also a management plan. Here is a very condensed, very short list. But history, present situation, strategy, preservation, restoration, and so on, implementation list, and so on. But I conclude. I think I have not much time, but in any way, I want to conclude with this consideration. A management plan is a participated process The maintenance of valued landscapes often requires the active collaboration of local communities in their planning, management, and sustainable development. A management plan is a process which has to be able to produce an economic value. In the Viale dei Colli project, we want to obtain a sustainable, multifunctional landscape. One possibility, and I believe strongly in this idea, is to reintroduce also all professions. For example, gardeners specialized in garden restoration or specific agricultural production. Thank you.